The meeting starts the way they always do. Polite smiles, coffee cups, a slide deck blowing softly on the wall. Someone near the head of the table proposes a collaborative initiative. The phrasing is generous, almost noble: shared visibility, mutual support, collective growth. Heads nod immediately. You watch the room carefully, not the words, the reactions, because something about the proposal feels precise, too precise. The man presenting it speaks slowly, confidently. He praises three colleagues by name before outlining the idea. Compliments first, structure second, credit distributed in advance. The room relaxes, and that is when you notice it. The idea itself quietly redirects control toward him. Deadlines route through his team. Reporting lines tighten. Information flows inward. The proposal is not collaboration, it is consolidation. But the room doesn't react. They nod. Someone even praises the generosity of the approach. You sit there realizing something uncomfortable. You are the only person in the room who saw the move the moment it appeared, not the content. The tactic: flattery first, authority later. Machiavelli described this maneuver centuries ago. Power rarely enters the room openly. It arrives disguised as cooperation. But something strange happens when you recognize it. You do not gain influence, you gain distance. Because everyone else in the room is responding to the performance, not the structure behind it. And the performance is working. You glance around the table again. Nobody seems alarmed. Nobody questions the mechanics. The praise continues, and for a moment you wonder if you are overthinking it. Maybe the plan really is collaborative. Maybe you are simply too suspicious. That thought provides a brief sense of relief, but then the next moment unfolds. A colleague across the table speaks up. He repeats a statistic from the presentation, a number that supports the proposal. You recognize the number instantly. It is misleading, not technically false, but positioned carefully enough to create the wrong conclusion. The room accepts it immediately. Nobody checks the context. Nobody asks where it came from, because the man who said it holds status. And status performs a strange function inside groups. It replaces verification. Machiavelli understood this well. People do not judge truth independently. They judge the speaker. Authority becomes evidence. You sit there noticing the structure again. The lie was not reckless, it was confident, delivered calmly, protected by rank, and the room rewards it with agreement. You feel the instinct to speak, to correct the framing, to point out the missing context. But something stops you, not fear, calculation, because you suddenly notice something else happening in the room, not with the speaker, with you. The moment you leaned forward slightly, someone at the far end of the table glanced in your direction, a brief look. Curious, measuring, it lasted less than a second. But it revealed something important. Your silence had already been noticed. You thought you were simply observing. But the room had begun observing you. Because people inside social systems sense when someone is not participating in the performance. They may not know why, but they feel the disturbance, and this is where perception becomes dangerous. Machiavelli wrote, "The power does not reward those who see clearly. It rewards those who control how things appear." There is a difference, a brutal one. Seeing the mechanism of influence does not place you above the system. It places you outside its rhythm, and outside rhythms attract attention. Later, the meeting ends. Chairs scrape softly against the floor. Conversations resume in small clusters. Someone laughs about a minor mistake in the slides. The man who proposed the initiative receives congratulations. You walk toward the hallway. Halfway there, you hear something behind you. Two colleagues speaking quietly, not hostile, just casual. He's always quiet in meetings. A pause. Yeah, he notices everything. The tone isn't admiration, it's uncertainty. That sentence follows you down the hallway like a shadow because you realize something unsettling. You thought clarity would give you advantage. Instead, it gave you a reputation, not the kind that attracts power, the kind that makes people cautious around you. And once you begin seeing the mechanics of human motives, you cannot return to the performance. Every compliment begins to sound strategic. Every joke begins to reveal hierarchy. Every agreement begins to expose allegiance. The theater becomes visible. And once the theater becomes visible, you stop belonging to the audience. But here is the part nobody tells you. When the audience realizes someone is watching the stage too carefully, they stop watching the play. They start watching you. The pattern becomes clearer the next week. Another meeting, different room, same structure. Your manager presents a half-formed idea about restructuring a project timeline. The explanation is vague, unfinished. Several pieces of the plan don't even connect yet. Nobody reacts immediately. The room waits. Because in most workplaces, thinking is not the first step. Permission is. Then a junior employee speaks. He repeats the manager's idea almost word for word. The same timeline, the same framing, the same weak logic. But he adds something subtle, a compliment. Honestly, that's a really smart way to approach the problem. The manager nods slowly, and suddenly the room changes temperature. Agreement spreads. People start building on the idea that 5 minutes earlier, nobody seemed interested in discussing. Your manager smiles. Exactly, he says. That's the direction I was thinking. The junior employee receives praise for his insight. You sit there watching the exchange unfold. Because the maneuver is obvious, it is not competence. It is alignment. The junior employee did not improve the idea. He strengthened the authority of the person who introduced it. Machiavelli described this behavior without hesitation. Power rewards those who reinforce its image, not those who examine its structure. You feel the familiar impulse to speak, because the plan still has flaws, serious ones. So when the discussion opens, you explain the risk clearly, directly, calmly. The timeline will collapse if the supplier delays again. The dependencies were calculated incorrectly. The project cannot move the way the proposal suggests. The room goes quiet. Not hostile, just uncomfortable. Your manager leans back slightly. Someone taps a pen on the table. A colleague glances at the laptop screen instead of responding. The information you presented is correct. Everyone in the room can see that. But accuracy creates a problem, because your analysis did something the junior employee carefully avoided. It challenged the idea, which means, indirectly, it challenged the authority attached to it. And hierarchy reacts poorly to that kind of clarity. The discussion moves on quickly. Someone reframes the conversation toward practical next steps. Your comments are acknowledged with a polite nod, then quietly ignored. 20 minutes later, the meeting ends. In the project summary email that arrives that evening, the timeline adjustment is credited to the junior employee. Your risk analysis appears as a minor footnote. Additional considerations were raised. No names attached. No ownership. Just background noise. You read the message and notice something unsettling. The person who understood the structure gained nothing. The person who supported the authority gained visibility. Machiavelli would not consider this unfair. He would consider it predictable. Because power systems do not promote the most perceptive individuals, they promote the most reliable ones. Reliable in loyalty. Reliable in loyalty. Reliable in reinforcement. Reliable in protecting the image of leadership. And this is where the real pressure begins. Seeing manipulation does not mean you can control it. Sometimes it only means you can no longer participate in it convincingly, and the system can sense that. The pattern does not stay inside offices. You see it in social rooms too. A small gathering, music low, people standing in loose circles, glasses in hand, conversations drifting between jokes and introductions. Across the room, a man is telling a story, nothing extraordinary, a travel anecdote, slight exaggerations, a confident voice. But the details of the story are not what holds attention. It's the way he delivers it. He interrupts himself to laugh. He lightly teases someone beside him. He speaks as if the room already belongs to him. and people respond exactly the way Machiavelli would predict. They lean in, not because the story is profound, because confidence performs status. Two women nearby laugh before the punchline even arrives. Another asks him a follow-up question that extends the moment. Validation flows toward the person who behaves as if validation is inevitable. You stand close enough to hear everything, and the structure becomes visible almost immediately. The pauses, the calculated eye contact, the casual touch on someone's shoulder to pull them into the conversation. None of it feels accidental. It's choreography. You notice how attention shifts in the room like gravity. People orient themselves toward the person projecting the strongest social certainty, not the most honest person, not the most thoughtful person, the most dominant presence. Someone asks what you do. You answer briefly, but your mind keeps observing the dynamics unfolding nearby. The man telling the story never asks deeper questions. He redirects conversations toward himself with subtle timing. And yet, the group treats him as the center of the evening, because attraction inside social environments rarely follows depth. It follows position. Later that night, you step outside for a moment. Cool air, a quieter street. You check your phone. A message you sent earlier still has no reply. A simple text, nothing heavy. But now your mind begins constructing patterns. Maybe the delay is intentional. Maybe silence is being used as leverage. Machiavelli wrote that perception shapes outcomes more than truth itself. In court politics, hesitation often signals calculated restraint. You stare at the screen longer than necessary. Was the pause strategic or meaningless? Someone inside laughs loudly through the open door. You look back toward the room. The confident storyteller is still surrounded by people. Attention hasn't moved, and suddenly something becomes uncomfortable. The people inside that room are not analyzing the interaction. They are participating in it. They feel chemistry where you see positioning. They feel attraction where you see hierarchy forming in real time. The same dynamic appears everywhere once you notice it. Who receives attention? Who is ignored? Who moves closer to the center of the group without asking permission? Others call it energy. You call it structure. And the more clearly you see it, the harder it becomes to behave as if you don't. It doesn't stop at work or at parties. Eventually, you start seeing the same mechanics inside friendships. One evening, you're sitting across from a friend at a small table. Coffee between you. Casual conversation drifting through familiar topics. Then the subject shifts. Someone from your circle made a mistake earlier in the week. A missed deadline. A decision that embarrassed the group. Your friend brings it up. At first, the tone sounds sympathetic. Honestly, it just got messy. But the explanation begins to bend slightly. Details change direction. Responsibility shifts. Your friend carefully reconstructs the story, so the absent person carries most of the weight. Not openly, not aggressively, just subtly. You notice how each sentence protects your friend's image. A missing detail here, a softened timeline there. By the end of the story, the narrative feels clean again. Too clean. You realize you're not listening to honesty. You're listening to reputation management. Machiavelli warned that alliances rarely survive pure truth. Stability inside groups depends on controlled versions of events. Your friend isn't lying outright, he's editing, and the edit serves a purpose. If the story spreads this way, his position remains untouched. You stir your coffee slowly. Part of you wants to mention the missing piece, the part of the story that would redistribute responsibility. But you don't, because something about the conversation already tells you what would happen. Not confrontation, something quieter. Distance. Later that week, you're with the same group again. A few drinks, loud conversation, music playing somewhere in the background. Someone brings up another friend who isn't there tonight. A joke starts forming. Nothing brutal, just a small imitation of his habits. The way he talks, the way he complains about work. People laugh. The imitation gets sharper. Another person adds a detail. Laughter grows louder. You watch the moment carefully. Because the joke isn't really about humor, it's about positioning. Everyone participating in the laughter is confirming the same thing. He is not here, which means he cannot defend his place in the hierarchy. Machiavelli would recognize the mechanism immediately. Loyalty inside groups often forms through shared exclusions. Mockery becomes a bonding ritual, a quiet reminder of who belongs safely inside the circle and who can temporarily exist outside it. You notice something else. Nobody objects. Even the people who seem slightly uncomfortable still smile, because interrupting the moment would break the social rhythm, and breaking rhythm inside a group has consequences. Later that night, your phone buzzes. Photos from a small gathering earlier in the week, a dinner, 5 people from your circle. You were not invited. No explanation, no message. Just images appearing after the fact. You scroll through them slowly. Faces you know well, the same easy laughter. For a moment, you try to find a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was spontaneous. Maybe numbers were limited. But the pattern feels familiar. Selective visibility, selective inclusion. Machiavelli understood that alliances often operate quietly. Invitations themselves become signals of position. You lock the phone and sit back, because another realization begins forming. You can see the structure holding the group together. The edited stories, the shared jokes, the controlled invitations, but pointing at the pattern would destroy the balance that keeps everyone comfortable. And once you see the balance, you also see the problem. The moment someone describes the game out loud, they stop being part of it. Eventually, you attempt something different, not confrontation, not analysis, restraint. You begin testing a quieter strategy. In the next meeting, the familiar pattern appears again. A proposal moves through the room, polished on the surface but fragile underneath. You see the weak points immediately, a dependency that hasn't been calculated, a timeline built on optimistic assumptions. Normally, your mind begins assembling the explanation before the conversation even reaches the discussion phase. But this time, you stop it. You sit back, hands folded loosely on the table. Someone asks if there are concerns. You say nothing. The silence feels deliberate. The discussion continues without resistance. People add small comments. Adjustments are made that keep the structure intact. Your manager nods approvingly. For the first time in weeks, the room feels relaxed around you. No tension. No subtle pauses when you begin speaking. You notice the difference instantly. Your restraint made you predictable again. Machiavelli observed something similar about courts and advisors. Rulers preferred those who reinforced stability, not those who complicated it. Understanding a flaw in the system does not always increase your influence. Sometimes it simply increases friction, and friction attracts caution. After the meeting, your manager stops by your desk. "Good input today," he says. "You gave no input, but the tone is friendly, approval without disruption." You nod slightly. The experiment seems to be working. Later that week, you attend another social gathering. Different room, different people, but the same social choreography unfolds. Confident voices dominate the conversation again. The same gestures, the same relaxed certainty. This time you decide to imitate the pattern. You slow your speech slightly. Hold eye contact a little longer than usual. Pause before answering questions. Nothing exaggerated. Just small signals you've watched others use. Something subtle shifts. People respond more easily. A conversation that might have ended quickly continues longer than expected. Someone laughs at a comment you barely thought about. The room feels smoother. For a moment, you feel a strange kind of relief. Maybe the problem was never perception. Maybe it was expression. Maybe seeing the structure was never the obstacle. Maybe you simply needed to perform inside it more carefully. Machiavelli often praised those who could adapt their appearance to the expectations of the moment. Power rarely belongs to the most insightful observer. It belongs to the person who performs certainty convincingly. You walk home that night with a quiet sense of adjustment. Work felt easier. Conversations felt lighter. Nothing in the world had changed. except the parts of your perception you chose not to reveal, but something begins happening beneath the surface. During the meeting, when you stayed silent, your mind continued mapping every flaw in the proposal. At the gathering, while you maintained eye contact and kept your tone under control, your thoughts kept analyzing every shift in attention around you. The observation never stopped. You simply hid it, and slowly a new tension appears, because silence does not remove perception, it traps it. And the more clearly you see the structure behind people's behavior, the heavier it becomes to pretend you don't. For a while, the strategy seems stable, silence where analysis used to appear, carefully measured participation, controlled expression. But repetition has a strange effect on perception. It sharpens it. Weeks pass at work, and the same pattern begins repeating so consistently that you no longer need to think about it. You can predict it. A project discussion starts. Someone introduces an idea that clearly originated somewhere else. The wording is slightly different, but the structure is identical to something mentioned earlier by a quieter colleague. The room responds exactly the way it always does. Nobody traces the origin. Credit flows to the person who delivers the idea with the most authority. Later, the original source of the idea remains silent. You watch the exchange without reacting, because now the maneuver feels mechanical. You have seen the same transfer of recognition so many times that the sequence plays out in your mind before it even finishes. Suggestion, repetition, authority confirmation, credit relocation. It happens in different departments with different people under different projects, but the structure never changes. Machiavelli would not call this corruption. He would call it political gravity. Power attracts recognition the way mass attracts objects. You notice something unsettling about this realization. The more predictable the behavior becomes, the less surprising it feels. But the less surprising it feels, the harder it becomes to participate in the illusion that it is fair. Outside the office, the same sensation starts appearing elsewhere. You're sitting with two friends one evening, listening to one of them describe a situation involving someone you both know. Halfway through the story, another friend joins the table. The tone shifts instantly. The person telling the story adjusts their version of events. The criticism softens. Certain details disappear. The new listener receives a different narrative than the one you heard 5 minutes earlier. It happens so smoothly that the shift might go unnoticed, but your mind catches the pivot immediately. The story changed because the audience changed. Machiavelli wrote that people shape their speech to protect alliances, not to preserve accuracy. You sit there watching the conversation continue as if nothing changed. Everyone else seems comfortable with the adjustment. But once you notice the shift, it becomes impossible to unsee. Another week passes. A small gathering is planned among friends. You hear about it casually. At first, it sounds like a simple get-together. Then someone hesitates while explaining who will be there. A name is mentioned, another name quietly removed. The explanation becomes vague. Plans changed. You realize something altered the invitation list, not logistics, position. Someone's status inside the group shifted slightly, enough to change who belongs at the table that night. No one says it directly, but the pattern sits there in plain view. Selective inclusion, selective distance. And this is where the strain begins to build, because the more environments you move through, the more the same behaviors repeat. Workplace hierarchies, social dominance, reputation management, audience-dependent truth, different rooms, same mechanics. At first you believe clarity would lead somewhere, toward control, toward mastery of the system, but something else happens instead. Your awareness expands faster than your ability to ignore what it shows you, and every new pattern you recognize removes another layer of the performance people expect you to believe. At some point, the patterns stop feeling separate. Work, friends, social gatherings. They begin merging into the same structure. Different rooms, different faces, different conversations, but the mechanics underneath start repeating with uncomfortable precision. You notice it one afternoon at work. A colleague is praising someone enthusiastically during a teen discussion. Compliments delivered with energy, respectful tone, almost generous. Honestly, she handled that project perfectly. The room nods, approval spreads easily. But 2 days earlier, in a quieter conversation near the elevators, the same colleague said something else entirely. Different tone, different audience. She actually made things harder for everyone. You remember the exact phrasing because it stood out at the time. The criticism wasn't emotional. I was careful, measured, strategic. And now the same person is performing admiration in public. The shift happens so smoothly that nobody else seems to notice the contradiction, but you do. Not because the inconsistency is shocking, because the adjustment follows a predictable rule. Speech aligns with advantage. Machiavelli wrote that survival in political environments requires mastery of appearance, not sincerity. Watching the interaction now, the logic becomes obvious. Public praise stabilizes alliances. Private criticism protects distance. Two different messages. One, reputation. You look around the table, nobody questions the change, because most people are not measuring consistency. They are measuring the atmosphere, and the atmosphere feels cooperative. Later that evening, you arrive at a small group gathering, nothing formal, just conversation in a familiar living room. You step through the doorway and immediately notice something subtle. The room quiets for half a second, not dramatically. Just a pause in the rhythm of the conversation. Someone clears their throat. Another person smiles quickly and asks how your week went. The discussion resumes. If you weren't paying attention, the moment would disappear unnoticed, but your mind catches it instantly. The pause happened because you entered the room, not because people fear you, because they know something about you now. You observe, carefully, consistently, and that awareness has become part of your reputation. You see it in the way certain conversations drift toward safer topics when you're nearby. You see it when someone finishes a sentence more cautiously than they started it. Nobody says anything directly, but the signal is there. The group understands something about you. You notice patterns, and people instinctively become careful around those who notice patterns. Because clarity changes the atmosphere of a room, not loudly, quietly. Machiavelli understood this dynamic centuries ago. The person who studies power too openly becomes a disturbance within the court, not an enemy, not an ally, something more uncomfortable, a witness. You stand in the kitchen later that night, listening to laughter from the living room. Nothing hostile has happened. Nobody excluded you directly, but the social temperature around you feels slightly different now. Conversations still happen. Invitations still appear, yet something invisible has shifted in the way people position themselves around you. Because once others suspect that you see the structure behind their behavior, they begin adjusting the structure when you're present. Not consciously, instinctively. And that realization leads somewhere unsettling. The more clearly you perceive the mechanics of human strategy, the more your presence reminds others that those mechanics exist. Which means the cost of clarity is not always confrontation. Sometimes it is something quieter, something harder to point at. A slow adjustment in how people move around you, as if awareness itself carries a weight the room would rather avoid. Years pass and the recognition becomes automatic. You no longer search for patterns, they appear on their own. Conversations begin, and you already know where the incentives will push them. Compliments appear, and you instinctively measure what they protect. Disagreements surface, and you quietly track which alliances they threaten. It happens without effort now. Workplaces change, new teams, new hierarchies, but the mechanics stay familiar. Someone presents an idea with confident certainty. Others echo it quickly, reinforcing the authority attached to it. A quieter voice raises a thoughtful objection that drifts away without traction. The sequence repeats so often that it feels rehearsed. Not because people planned it, because systems reward the same behavior everywhere. You used to think knowledge would help you navigate these systems more effectively. That was the original illusion. Knowledge, you believed, was neutral, a tool, something you could carry without consequence. Machiavelli understood something colder. The moment a person begins seeing the mechanisms of power clearly, their position inside those mechanisms changes, not dramatically, subtly. Observers alter the environment simply by existing inside it. One evening, you find yourself at another gathering. A familiar setting. Soft music, people leaning against kitchen counters, conversations folding into one another. Across the room, someone begins telling a story about a project at work. Halfway through, you recognize the structure immediately. The speaker subtly exaggerates their role in the outcome. Another person nearby confirms the narrative with enthusiastic agreement. Credit begins consolidating around the storyteller. You have seen the maneuver enough times that the ending becomes obvious before the story finishes. Someone laughs. Another person praises the effort. The version of events becomes reality inside the room. You look around. Everyone seems comfortable with it. No tension, no analysis. The performance works because the audience accepts it, and for a moment you remember how easy it once felt to participate in that acceptance, to hear the story without measuring its structure, to laugh without tracking the hierarchy behind the joke. But perception doesn't reverse itself. Once human motives become visible, they remain visible. Machiavelli would say the court always contained these dynamics. You simply learned how to see them. And that knowledge never behaves like a harmless tool. It becomes a lens, a permanent one. Every room now reveals the same architecture beneath the conversation, status moving quietly between voices, loyalty shaping what people say, attention gravitating toward confidence instead of accuracy. Others still move comfortably inside the performance. They laugh, they agree, they build stories together without questioning the structure holding them up. You notice the structure, which means the performance never fully closes around you again, not because you reject it, because you understand it. And understanding something too clearly creates a quiet classification that follows you everywhere. The person who sees the mechanism, the person who hears the motive inside the sentence, the person who watches the theater instead of the play. Clarity gives you something real, but it takes something with it. The simple comfort of believing the stage is not there.